So the question that this talk puts is Corp Gov, the cause of the current malaise is really a way to ask, do we matter, right? I mean, does our research really matter? Do we count in the world for better or for worse? Now for worse. And I want to acknowledge that I've spent a lot of time discussing this with some of you here, John Armour, Ron Gilson, sorry, Ron. You know, so I've benefited a lot from that discussion. In the course of preparing to give this talk today, I have about 40 slides I rehearsed earlier. We'd be here till 3, so I'm going to actually use mostly notes rather than the slides. So what is the malaise? It's inequality, it's the economic insecurity, it's slow economic growth throughout the OECD, and the fact that the US has got 3.8% unemployed and a positive growth rate of 2%, but flat wages, obviously hardly the worst, but it's also meh. And so the question is to whether the governance regime that we have promoted is in any way the cause of inequality and economic security and slow growth. I've got about 40 slides, which when I rehearsed would take us here till noon. So I just want to distill the basic points here. On inequality, there are 2 governance-related channels. 2 governance limitation channels, one of which is the failures of governance a generation ago when it came to the awarding of executive comp. Far too many stock options, golden parachutes, which have distorted the market for executive comp, so that when we say today the bargaining is at arm's length, it's sort of like it's a post-Edenic world. There was original sin in the 80s when the Delaware courts shut down the market and control as an adaptive measure. Weak boards powered on stock options and parachutes, that became the baseline, and we're kind of stuck with it. And so a clear example of this is parachutes, right? So the idea of a golden parachute is how do you overcome the managerial resistance to a takeover bid at a good price, one of which is you construct a compensation agreement in which he or she, because of the accelerated of vested options, can get truly rich. And so incentives are aligned, and the bids go forward. Well, ratchet forward ratchet forward a generation ago, boards now are much better. Governance is much better. The asset managers are much better. The parachutes remain. It shows the extent of the lock-in from prior distorted ideas as to what comp can be. And the point is that we've locked in a distorted way because we think of what the market is. Well, you know, it's not clear that that's the baseline. That is an adequate one. All right, so that's one point. The second governance failure is the idea of weak boards in what Ron and I call the Board 2.0 model, the Mel-Eisenberg model, in which you had thinly informed boards who basically are able to observe managerial performance by looking at the stock price and not much else, so that if managers have plans that can't be revealed because it would give away competitive advantage or because the market just couldn't figure it all out, they face an activist risk. So the concern is that they'll pull in their horns and pursue second-best business strategies. So here comes the PE folks. And the take-private movement, in effect, lets these firms pursue first-best strategies, which is great in one sense, but the distribution of those gains is distorted. So if you think about all the economic inequality stories, the increases to the 1% are linear. The increases to the 0.01% are exponential. And it's the PE firms, and when you look at the tax data, which is the basis for the income stories, it's flow-through entities, which are the PE guys who essentially are taking advantage of the failed governance mechanisms that might provide boards with the chance to pursue first best strategies to pursue those gains which otherwise might be shared by the public shareholders as a group for themselves. So the governance failure, the failure to come up with a better model for the public firm board, it seems to me is also a source of inequality. All right, so that's income inequality. The second, perhaps more serious, is economic insecurity and instability. So what the hostile bids did is take advantage of the fact that the governance models that then existed permitted firms to run with 50% slack. The bids, in effect, eliminated that slack, or a significant part of the slack for the most part. The slack being often jobs from somebody else. But the point is, you had the interaction of the governance model with the governance externalities associated with these bids. So the reason that the hostile bids have declined, in my view, is less because of Delaware, and it's just say no entitlements, but because managers and boards, in the effort to avoid becoming a target of an unsolicited bid, eliminated slack on their own. So firms are increasingly run on an efficiency model which has effects on, say, employees and other stakeholders, and increasing economic instability in ways I'll identify in a second. Similarly, the activist story is about slack reduction. So in effect, we now see an era in which firms can run with, say, 20-25% slack, not enough to attract a bid, but an activist taking advantage of concentrated ownership and the reputation developing possibilities of repeat play, now are pursuing firms where slack is 20%, let's say. And they've been very successful for that reason. So once again, the interaction between that innovation and the externalities associated with that are now moving firms in this high-powered governance world to one in which the level of slack is much, much lower. But the effect, of course, is on the employees. In theory, the job loss classical would say, well, wait, the employees ought to be used to higher valued use. Isn't it great that they're not wasting their time at these firms which are not making good use of them? But we know, as an empirical matter, that the displacement effects are really quite large. There are frictions to movement, there's the loss of firm-specific investments, there's demoralization. The very fact of competitive environments may be an element in keeping the wages down in the first place. So the governance setup we've got, I think, plays a definite role in the economic insecurity that's more generally found in the economy. And so you might even think that the labor share, the decline of it over time relates in part to the way that the governance setup works to transmit the external forces, globalization, the innovation, the technology. The global forces are brought down to the firm level through the means of governance, and governance affects the speed with which they are written off. That's part of, I think, a critical story. And we also see, in effect, a change in risk shifting. So the shareholders are quite able now to diversify against idiosyncratic risk at the firm level. We have it as a theory, we have the asset managers who provide it as a vehicle, and therefore they're more willing for firms to take risk. They're much less concerned about the idiosyncratic issues relating at the firm level. But the employees, the diversification capacity of the employees has not improved. And I think it's sort of some of the mismatch that has arisen between the ability of the shareholders to diversify these risks and the flat ability of the employees to do it that is a core part of the economic story. Greater idiosyncratic risk for the employees out of the current governance setup. The final point I want to address in at least an opening way is the slower economic growth. Now, this is itself obviously a complex empirical and theoretical claim. I'm a skeptic of it. Look at the long-term players: Amazon, Google, Walmart. The source of instability is from them. So this mismatch between the externalities, if you want to call it, the risk bearing of employees and short-termist behavior seems to me the reverse. It's the long-term guys are going to completely blow up the way we do things now and impose whatever costs we might be concerned about. Right-termism, it seems to me, is the correct way to think about it, and the Apple cycle will be different from the GE cycle when it builds a jet engine. And to sort of get caught up in the religious debates seem to me to be distracting from the business facts that are going along. And moreover, one can't ignore the way that governments interfere with the abilities of firms to plan over the long term. When the euro is at risk, not only 3 years ago, but maybe today, right? When the U.S. is in the position of pivoting from one idea about international trade to a mercantilist strategy, right, which would disrupt the supply chains all over the world, how are firms supposed to plan in the long term for that, right? What would it even mean? And I think that the governments are part of those who promoted the idea that firms are behaving in the short term to mask their own failures. The governments, having pursued the fiscal strategies of austerity post-crisis, are looking to firms with cash on the balance sheet and saying, aha, Keynes, you could provide the stimulus that the policy strategies we've chosen haven't. So what are the corporate governance solutions? There's the Board 3.0 solution, which again, I've developed elsewhere, basically having a much more robust idea of the board, of some part of the board that's basically extremely well resourced, that has strong incentives, and that can credibly, in response to an activist with the slide deck, say to the owners, the BlackRocks of the world, you know, we have a better theory and we've thought about it. So that all of a sudden opens the governance space for the public firm and permits financial inclusion to a greater extent. I think that would be a positive. One could think of the concerns about economic instability as a market failure in insurance. Insurance are unable, the individual firms are unable to write good insurance policies against layoffs for many reasons, including the fact that if a single firm actually did it, then there would be a selection effect among the employees that came to that firm. But there are many other issues, and they're kind of discussed in the slides in the paper. But government could conceivably write that insurance policy. Similarly, we might think of the need, given the high-powered governance regime in which we're in, there's now open space for a new government match with firms. So implicitly, there is a government match. Government provides K through 12 or K through 18 levels of training. But given the economy we have evolved to, maybe the government match about long-term efforts to reinvigorate what parties know and can bring to employers, that's part of what the government really needs to think about. So this brings me finally to the governance dimension, which is the managers, the asset manager types, the BlackRocks, the Vanguards. What is the product that they sell? They sell a product, for the most part, in index investing, which is, the portfolio is diversified. They eliminate idiosyncratic risk. What is their product? What is the risk of their product? It is systemic risk. And so they can improve the outcome for those who buy their products by either increasing returns across the whole economy, and I take it that's part of what some of the stewardship claims are really about. How do we improve overall economic performance with this incantation of long-termism? But they could also reduce systemic risk. If, you know, the classic risk, utility is risk-adjusted returns. And so if you think that efficiency has been a goal of what the shareholders want, perhaps the asset managers, precisely because they are selling a product that bears systemic risk, stability becomes part of what they now need to be concerned about. Because markets are international. The governance regimes are national. And if somehow we don't think of the instability creating features of the governance environment, there's a good chance we will produce outbreaks that will increase systemic risk. So the asset managers have I think, a hard job to think about, which is how could they be part of the thinking that would maybe combine efficiency and stability concerns which could involve better insurance schemes. Because I do think that given the product that they're offering, I mean, ironically, their failure to think about that does not serve their clients well. Anyway, so there's a lot more behind this, but I just wanted to put this out and open a discussion and leave plenty of time for this very well-informed audience.
Okay, great. So I will summarize the paper the way I read it. I gotta say, I heard some new ideas today, so I apologize if there's a little bit, if I focused on certain things in my discussion. So let me dive right in. So what is this paper about? The paper really talks about a bunch of large systematic weaknesses in our governance/financial system. What does the paper focus on? First of all, inequality. And in the paper, 3 particular dimensions of inequality are highlighted. First of all, the consistent increase in executive compensation. Second of all, the increase or the gains of private equity funds. That's the second dimension of the paper. And the last dimension is the labor share decreasing, meaning that the fraction of the salary that employees get as a fraction of the total output, meaning they're getting less from everything that's being produced. The second focus of the paper is economic insecurity. So as Jeffrey explained, there's more insecurity in today's world. There's more changes, there are more technological changes. So even if you have a certain skill, that skill may not be beneficial or useful in 2 years. So employees are increasingly facing more economic insecurity. And the third dimension is slow economic growth, which again falls on the shoulders of the employees and face more uncertainty. The paper asks, okay, why are we having all these issues? So why are we having all these issues? The paper identifies the corporate governance of public firms, meaning who makes decisions within a firm as a weakness that is common to all these problems that I mentioned in the first part. The paper also talks about a little bit about ownership, how increasing ownership of financial institution drives some of these weaknesses, and I'll talk about that in a minute in my discussion. And finally, the solution. The paper suggests that there should be increased government involvement to solve some of these problems. For example, the paper says, look, if there is an increasingly misfit between skills of employees and what the market needs, because the market is changing all the time, their government should be more involved in training employees and updating their skills and helping them refit in the market so that they have the skills that the market needs. And it's not their fault that their skills need to be updated. It's actually the market's fault, because the governance is not ideal. Firms do what's good for them, but for them it's not good to train the employees so that they have updated skills. So let me tell you some of my thoughts. So executive compensation, I think this, the argument that executive compensation is increasing and it's growing continuously, that continues a large literature that talks about what is executive compensation actually optimal. So we have one literature that talks about agency theory and that contracting is optimal and that shareholders know what they do and they can design contracts that actually serve the interests of shareholders and make sure that they get what they want. And then we have another set of literature that is more critical of Chicken Fried, and they say, look, there's too much power to executives. They're getting too much. They are essentially, there's not enough monitoring going on. They can extract too much, and unless there's an outrage from shareholders, they're extracting too much salary. I think that the paper fits into that literature, into the second strand of literature. And here's where I think the paper can make some contribution relative to that prior literature. I think the paper can make a contribution relative to the recommendations it makes on what their government can do, and I think it can also make a contribution if it focuses a little bit on ownership. And let me delve into that a little bit in the next slide. So this paper really talks about how there's an increasingly larger problem of governance, and that governance problem raises all these issues that I've talked before. So, larger compensation, larger inequality, and so on. So let's understand a little bit what is driving this increased problem of governance. I mean, because behind that word of governance, there are shareholders, and governance should represent the interest of shareholders. So I want to go a step back and understand the changes that have occurred in the last 15 years or so in shareholder structure to understand whether those changes can really be driving some of the governance issues identified in the paper. And so what I did here, I just did a very simple graph from 2001 to 2014, and in this graph I graphed the different types of shareholders that the average company has in the US. So for example, and we're looking here approximately, I would say, at a Russell 3000 plus an additional subset of smaller companies. So what you can see, as we all know, is that institutional ownership, that's the top green line, has gone up from 0.4 to about 0.55. I know it's lower than what you'd expect. That's because this set also includes smaller companies. At the same time, if you look at the red line, these are the non-13F block holders. So that's everyone else. Those are the individuals. Those are private companies, public companies. Those are hedge funds that you usually don't see because they don't file 13Fs. So that's everyone else. That's in the red line. These guys are actually going down. And so if you think about it, just by focusing on these two rows, what we're seeing is we're having more shares held by the BlackRocks and so on that have thousands of companies, and we have fewer companies with a block holder that is more concentrated on the company. I'll show you a bit more on that in the next slide. But just a little bit more here, you can see the total fraction of shares held by mutual fund, that's the black line, goes up. Index fund, not surprisingly, that's a turquoise line, goes up. The paper also talks a little bit about private equity and hedge funds. I graphed these as well, and you can see that's actually pretty stable. 1% or so of the companies have a block holder that is hedge funds. And finally, I also want to point out the light green line, which is the 13F block holders. That's a subset of the green line at the top. You can actually see that the block holders of the financial institutions are actually pretty stable. So yes, financial institutions have more assets, but they seem to be spread out across more firms. They don't seem to be more concentrated in fewer companies. And so I think what this suggests is that you get more dispersed shareholders. And if you have more dispersed shareholders and lots of little shareholders, some of these companies, for example, if you look at HP, they have hundreds of mutual funds just holding HP. How do you coordinate hundreds of mutual funds? That's really, really difficult to do. I think that creates a very difficult environment to govern effectively a company. I forgot to mention this data, most of it is coming from paper I have with Charlie Hadlock. I never use my own data in discussions, but this time I thought it was useful, so forgive me. And I have one more slide, and again, then I'm not talking anything more about my stuff, but just one more slide, which I think just highlights again the way I see the real weaknesses of governance as they've been evolving over the last 15 years. This is a really, really simple graph that shows us the difference. I think some really basic differences between financial blocks and non-financial blocks, and I think that explains why they govern differently. So for example, if we look at the top here, the average block size, a non-financial, the average fraction of shares the non-financial block holds in the company is 14.1%. Whereas the financial block, this is again conditional on them holding at least 5% because that's what we can observe for all blocks. For financial blocks, it's 8.6%. expected block duration for non-financials is 4.29, for financials is 3.29. So they hold their block for a shorter period of time. And I think the last one is particularly startling. Non-financials hold on average 1.39 blocks, whereas financial institutions hold on average more than 10 blocks. So if you're holding 10 blocks, and you need to have, plus a million other little companies, or companies in which you're holding smaller stakes, you need to have your attention at the same time in all the companies. And as Jennifer quoted yesterday, the paper of Scott and Lucian, I had the same quote before I saw it in her discussion. As they show, basically financial institutions devote less than 1 day per worker for a company in each year. So if you have just 1 working day per year that you devote for a company, there's only so much governance you can do. Whereas if you're a non-financial block, you can devote a lot more attention to a company. So why am I telling you all this? I'm telling you all this because I think that if we're moving in a direction where we have fewer non-financial blocks and we have more assets invested in financial institutions, and these financial institutions are, as they should be, they're continuing to be more spread out. They're not more concentrated. We're going to have an increased governance problem because we don't really have someone who is closely monitoring the company for long-term, holds a large stake, and has all his attention devoted to that company. And I think that's a lot of where the problems that are highlighted in the paper are really being driven from. So I'm going to continue now. I'm sorry to talk so much about this. I'm going to skip this because this was not discussed in the discussion, so there's no point in talking about it. So one of the points made in the paper is that there's this decreased stock, and that shareholders are not willing to tolerate that anymore. The paper makes the point, which is that it used to be that if there was stock, you'd have a takeover, but that's out of fashion now. So if there's stock now, we have the hedge funds coming in and kind of knocking on the table and making sure that it doesn't continue. The paper says, look, it used to be that you could have 50% or more slack. Now, if you have 20% slack, you have an activist coming in and making sure that this continues. And I asked myself, is it really? I'm not saying it's not true. I'm just saying I would like to see some evidence for that, and I'll show you some graphs, which, I am not familiar with this. Just some graphs which I think may raise some questions about it. So we'll go to the next slide. So at the very top, I think, did you show that? I think you showed that graph. We have the labor share of output from 1947 to 2016. As you can see, the labor share is really decreasing over time, and Jeff showed us that graph. But if it was really that stock is becoming less tolerable, then what I would expect to see is that the layoffs and discharges are increasing over time because companies are not willing to tolerate inefficient and unusable employees, so they fire them. But in fact, we actually see an opposite trend. This is just from 2002 to 2018. But other than the financial crisis, overall we see the opposite trend. But if we look at CO pay growth, guess what? The CO, as we all know, everyone probably has seen this graph. From 1980 to 2015 or so, CO pay went up by 997%, whereas the typical worker pay only went up by 10.9%. So I don't know, putting all this together makes me think that, yes, inequality absolutely grew, and I see that clearly from the first graph, because employees are getting a much smaller share of the outputs that they're producing, but let's remember that labor share includes the salary of the CO. So actually the problem is further exacerbated because not only do the employees get less, out of that cake of which they do get, the CO is actually getting more. And I don't know if it's because of that shareholders are less tolerant to slack, because if that would be the case, then I would expect to see a decrease in the layoffs. Okay, so what I wanted to do for this discussion, but I didn't find data, so I'm going to make a recommendation. One of the nice things that you can do as a law scholar, which you can't do as a finance scholar, is you can just show correlations, which I think are very useful. But if I would do that, it wouldn't be published. But in the law journal, it's a really, a nice thing to do. So I think it would be really interesting because, again, I think that a lot of what you're discussing is really driven by ownership. It would be really interesting. This is such an old table, but I couldn't find something more updated. This is from Laporta, Lopez, and so on, and it shows the 20 largest firms by market capitalization, and are they widely held or not. And I just highlighted the U.S. to show that in the U.S., most of the companies are widely held. I think it would be interesting to have such a panel data for a bunch of companies and just examine the main variables you're discussing. For example, CEO pay ratio. Just do simple correlations. Do we see that in countries where they're widely held firms, we have higher CEO pay ratios, more inequality? Just maybe someone did it and I couldn't find it, but I did look. I looked for something and I couldn't find anything on the international level. I think that would be a little helpful. Okay, so let's talk about the solution. How much more time do I have? Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the solution. And you're suggesting that the government should be a little bit more involved in maybe designing a system that would A, maybe solve some of the governance issues, and B, also, I guess that's it, really design a more efficient governance system. So I wanted to focus again on executive compensation, and I wanted to ask, maybe there could be something more efficient that could be done. Now, I know we're in the U.S. and suggesting that the government be involved in executive compensation on a legislative level probably sounds crazy, but I wanted to share with you a little bit, a little experience that I had, and B, an interesting study that I saw on this, and maybe that can give you some just inspiration on some other ideas. So I wanted to start with a little experience that I had in my prior life before I was an academic. I actually was working at the Ministry of Finance in Israel at the Government Companies Authority, which basically meant that I sat on boards of government companies. It was a very interesting job, and part of what we did was once a year we would meet and we would decide whether the CEO should get a bonus or not. Now the bonus, by the way, was tiny. It was that's all we could give. It was like a few $1,000s, but it was a big deal. Still, it was only employees only got tiny bonuses. And we always, even when we had a CEO, which we thought was horrible, and we thought he wasn't professional, we didn't believe him, we always gave the maximum bonus. Why did we do that? No, I tell you, and that's why I put this picture, because imagine yourself, every month and a half, you have to meet the CEO, and you have to sit around the table, you have to meet him again, you have to work with him collaboratively. Now, if you didn't give him the bonus, he's not going to be nice to you, he's not going to work with you. And so we always gave the maximum bonus to the CEO. We did not always give the employees the maximum bonus because we didn't have to meet them face to face. But we did have to meet the CEO. And so we always gave the CEO the maximum bonus. I'm telling you, even I have one particular CEO in my head who was awful. In the end, he got, but even he got the maximum bonus. So I asked myself whether, the current system where the board continuously works with the CEO, and there's no limit to the bonus. We had a limit in our setting, but here there's no limit, and you have to make the CEO happy so that he will continue collaborating with you. And so next time when you meet him in a month and a half, he will work with you. And so that brings me to almost my last slide, which is a really interesting study which I saw recently come out on SSRN. It's called "Do Executive Compensation Contract Maximize Firm Value? Evidence from Quasi-Natural Experiments." So this is about a legislative change in Israel, which is where I'm originally from. In that setting, what happened was that the government limited the executive compensation for a subset of companies by a substantial amount. I'd say they limited it by about half of what it was. And what the study does is it looks at the abnormal returns around this event, and it looks at what happened to firm value. And it finds that the firms that were affected by it actually had benefited from positive abnormal returns. Now, I'm not saying that that there should be aggressive government intervention and saying how much compensation should be awarded and there should be a limit set. I'm just saying that it's very difficult as a director not to be very generous in the compensation you award, and then you have to continue working with that CEO. So maybe some ideas of some buffers to the current setting, maybe that could be beneficial. And I think examining international settings like this one, we don't know yet how it's going, what the long-term effect is. We don't know yet whether maybe the good employees will leave, maybe they'll have a hard time recruiting new employees, and maybe performance in the long term will suffer. We don't know yet all of that. But I do think that looking at international settings like this one, and the one Jennifer mentioned yesterday about the 2 strikes in Australia, which I wasn't familiar with, I think maybe we can get some ideas also about what can be done in terms of governance in the U.S. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm just going to have a quick couple responses because I want to hear more. On governance change, here I think it's a matter of governance self-help. So the Board 3.0 model that we're devising is one that boards could opt into and provide themselves a different way of relating to the activists who show up with a slide deck, and thereby make it more feasible for a firm to remain in the public space pursuing a difficult to understand strategy rather than turning to the PE guys. And so in effect, it's a way to avoid corner solutions of which the dual class common stock, that's one corner solution. Take private is another corner solution. If the public firm governance space were richer, then the claim would be more firms would remain in that space and financial inclusion would be improved. That helps those who have stock like us. On executive comp, I don't, the Australia example is kind of a neat one. I don't have really a good idea. The point I wanted to make is that the distortions emerged at an early stage, and they set the market. So the claim that it's the normative defense of the market today, which I think is fragile precisely because the lock-in effects of path dependency create a market which is hard to defend. And Lucian's work sort of suggests in part why. And, just to elaborate a little bit, the irony here is from, all right, so pay, as I have seen it, is on the one hand, it's incentive-based, and on the other hand, it's profit-sharing based. Pay for performance is kind of a mush of those two ideas. If you had a really strong board, you could use fixed pay. And precisely because stock options look at a publicly available figure, right? The incentives associated with saying, if you move the stock price by X%, you get an additional amount of fixed pay, provides as much incentive as stock options in its own way, which are also geared to a publicly available figure. So, and then the amount of the stock options is what share of the gains the shareholders want to give away to the management team, right? The pay for performance idea itself, I think, facilitates a distortion in pay. But I think we're kind of stuck with that just because of the lock-in. And the golden parachute story I use as evidence for how hard it is to change an obviously inefficient regime, right? We now have boards that are fully able to accept a bid no matter what the management team really wants, right? But golden parachutes, which were put in place precisely to deal with boards that had limits in their ability to do that, the rationale for them has changed. I wrote an article in 2007 which said I thought golden parachutes would now begin to change because of the way that the owners had become wise to some of these governance issues. That was after Lucian's book was out. And it's been a decade, and the form of governance parachutes, has remained roughly unchanged, and they deliver huge amount of economic gains to managers in a takeover. So, You know, that's I think a legacy of the weak governance of the 70s and 80s, the Delaware court's refusal to let the markets work well. I'm not sure what we're going to be able to do about that. There are a lot of very good points that I will need to reflect upon in some of the other slides, but I just wanted to react to those things and get your reactions here. Yeah, Tobias.
Just a tiny point about the link between institutional investor ownership and insecurity for labor. I agree that in the first place there, of course, is an increase in risk if you diversify because you're willing to take more risk, but there's a second round effect, which is that if you are an institutional investor, you're caring about your whole portfolio, meaning that if one firm in the portfolio fails for idiosyncratic reason, another firm in your portfolio snatches up this market share, if it's not just depleting overcapacities in the economy. And that means that for that firm, you're all of a sudden interested in the availability of workforce, which somewhat attenuates the effect on labor, because you could make the argument that if these people are interested in beta, they would train the workforce in order to be employable at other firms too. And that, at least in theory, could be some sort of countervailing effect here. And I don't know how you relate to that.
Well, I guess in my vision that I'm sketching out here, it seems to me that that's better a government function, because there are many ways that what I'm calling the insurance payout might take place, right? It might be salary replacement for a while. It might be help to move to a different city where there are more jobs. It might be retraining. I don't think, you know, the asset managers are in a position to do that. But they could be in a position to foster government policies that did that on the ground, right? And so that's in a way the challenge to them, given that the product they sell is about systemic risk, return and systemic risk, right? Does that change a way that they've now thought about local governance issues? And what does occur to me is that they have a reason from the point of view of the welfare of their clients to think in broader terms. And so Larry Fink's letter, bless his heart, about, you know, firms should think in long-termist ways, right, it doesn't necessarily move the dial on these questions.
Just a bit of a tangential thought, but in the last 2 decades, pay inequality has raised spectacularly throughout the whole spectrum of occupations. You know, you compare workers with plant workers, with engineers, with traders, and in that backdrop, CEO pay is stagnant, actually, which is a complete oddity, right? So it seems to me that CEO pay has been in a bit of an abnormal state for the last 2 decades. You know, there's some constraint there. You know, it is distorted, but maybe not in at least the level. You know, of course, there's all the subtleties, but the level of CEO pay has behaved abnormally, has been abnormally moderate for the past 2 decades, and maybe we are partly part of this story. Maybe it was coming from a too high point, but it does seem that this doesn't. It's completely at odds with the general backdrop of skills and education being more levered in the labor market, right? So, you know, there's something there that we need to understand better, actually.
You mean as to what the source of the CEO pay increase is?
Well, there's no CEO pay increase in a backdrop where every skilled worker in any country in the last 20 years has doubled their you know, every...
CEO pay has been flat.
Completely flat, yes.
I don't know, if you have a lot of rents, it's hard to claim you're entitled to more of them, right? I mean, in other words, I would have to look at the specific CEO pay growth. The absolute levels are still quite substantial, right? I mean, they've grown at a rate higher than the growth in the S&P, it looks like, doesn't it? I mean, just looking at this rough chart.
Yeah, I mean, so if you compare CEO pay with, the lowest workers of the company pay, probably the gap has increased. But if you compare the CEO pay with the 20th highest paid worker in the company, that gap has narrowed down massively. Or the 100th highest paid worker in the company, that gap has narrowed down massively.
Well, I mean,
across countries and across.
One argument would be that since CEO pay is the result of weak governance, deformed governance, and is not market-based, whereas the 20th or the 30th highest paid employee might, then the market increase for the 2030 employee would predict an increase, whereas since the CEO pay was in effect detached from truly a market, it would not be related to a market trend of that sort. In a way, you might say that's evidence for the view that CEO pay is in fact really not set by a market process in the same way.
What do you think this number, the CO versus number 100? When we looked at the CO versus number 5, that gap has been trending up. So the number of 1 versus, I'm done.
This is the CEO slice, right?
I think number 5 is probably an executive as well. So probably it's bound by the same kind of non-market forces.
For number 1 versus just 100. I haven't seen it. So
I suspect that number is narrowing down because the wage inequality is growing massively. The average wage student is stagnant, but the wage of skilled individuals has been growing a lot in the last 2 decades, and CEO pay is flat. So I think I have to infer that gap is narrowing down. The trader versus the CEO of a financial, or not the trader anymore, but fund manager versus the CEO, that gap must be narrowing down.
we don't have numbers, but if you take probably 4 or 5 decades, each of us would be speculating over 4 decades. It will tremendous.
Can I say something in this? I don't think CEO pay is at all relevant to it. When people think of income inequality, it is not that CEOs make so much more than the median worker. It's that people who have no education or low education, lower middle income, there's a huge gap, and I think that's his point. And people like ourselves who are educated, college or otherwise, have much higher income, and that's what people are talking about, income inequality. So I actually don't see what corporate governance and what they're paying CEOs, how that gets at what the main income inequality problem is in most developed countries.
Income inequality, people usually talk about the top 1% or the 0.1%. I don't know what the salaries are in here.
No, we're talking about the gap is between educated people and non-ed people who don't have college education that people are worried about.
Look, I mean, it is certainly the
You can cut
case.
CEOs' pays by 50 to 60%, and we'll still have an income gap.
Right. No, I mean, these are not inconsistent views, right? I mean, there is an inequality issue separate from the gap between the CEOs and the median employees that we've now seen discussed, right? But that doesn't mean that from the point that from a political point of view, a social demoralization point of view, that the gap between the highest paid and the median won't have very important effects in distorting the political environment in which some of these choices are making, and in the same way that the absolute dollars that the PE guys get. I mean, there are a lot of dollars. And the median worker, that too, those are separate strands of the inequality debate. But nevertheless, since they play a large role in shaping social attitudes about the question, and this is my claim, that they stem from corporate governance failures at an early stage that have persisted in distorted markets, then it's just to identify the corporate governance links, which are by no means the only part of the story. That's the claim here.
So I think, if I may,
Yeah.
in the interest of time, I would collect maybe 3 more
Yes. Okay.
So I just want to make a data point, since a lot of what I do now is health policy. In the U.S., at least, in the last 25 years, there has been substantial increase in compensation, and 100% of it has gone to healthcare.
100%.
Of the increase in compensation, including the cost of employer-provided health insurance.
You're right.
Right? So, and on aggregate, there has been increase, and you mismeasure inequality and trends in inequality greatly if you don't take into account the explosion in healthcare costs. And I also think that until we do something about the explosion in healthcare costs, we're going to struggle to do something about inequality. We got to measure it right and then realize how big a contributor to wage inequality healthcare cost explosion really has been.
Jeff, a lot of the questions have been about the positive structure of your argument. That is, what is the channel, or to what extent does executive compensation contribute to inequality? What's the marginal addition of this? I want to ask a normative question. So, do you think inequality should be a concern for corporate law, corporate governance in its own right? So, we tend to think that we should be concerned with efficiency, welfare, and that it's for the state to sort out issues of inequality. But if the state can't do it, or the state doesn't do it, should corporate law be concerned with that? Is that actually what you're saying? Or are you concerned about inequality for some lesser or more instrumental reason, that is that it brings about inefficiencies or something like that? So I'd like to understand what the concern is underlying this normatively.
Right. Well, in a small bore way, I think inequality on the dimension of financial inclusion could actually be improved by an improvement in governance, a Board 3.0 model. I think a dimension of inequality which is hard to defend, golden parachutes, could be eliminated if ISS were to focus on it and make it the subject of a campaign, because it is hard to defend. On the broader issue, here it's the interaction between the governance models we've evolved, which permit diversification, minimization at the shareholder level, but the risk is shifted onto employees, and thus the institutions which are the intermediaries of the transformation, i.e. the asset managers, I think now face a choice as to the strategies that they might pursue. So the governance that has evolved moves up to a level of institutions that we as scholars concern ourselves about, these financial intermediaries. And the idea, so think about the think. I said that the seller of a product that is a diversified portfolio is thinking systemically, right? And so what it can do is to increase the return on the economy, and that, I take it, is the Larry Fink letter. A view that long-termist thinking will increase the overall returns, right? But he hasn't thought about systemic risk. And so the claim that I'm making is that the high-powered governance model we've created adds a certain kind of systemic risk, which is that there could be massive breakdowns in the political consensus that sustains it. That would be to the cost of all of us, the cost of everyone. And that the question then becomes, do financial intermediaries which are offering this product that have the characteristics of fomenting the high-powered governance system, then as they rethink their role of, quote, stewardship, does it become part of the mandate that they have to think through? I guess that's the broader way of thinking about it. I appreciate the push. Oh, we now have a manager.
Whoa. Yeah, I just want to come, it's Michelle Atkins from BlackRock here. I want to come back on one point, because you brought it up a couple of times, Jeff. Larry focuses on long-termism in his letter, and we look at long-termism in the work of my team because our clients are all saving, or 2/3 of them are saving for retirement. They are long-term investors, and that's why we deliver that message pretty consistently in everything we do. In his letter this year, which is on our website if anyone's interested to read it, he talks at some length about the retirement crisis that many developed economies are facing right now, and the need to retrain workers who are being left out both on an income side and a job opportunity side and an education opportunity side. So he does, these things are really front of mind for us. And I don't want anyone leaving this room thinking we're ignorant of the macroeconomic conditions in which our clients are living and saving and for which we're investing, because it is front of mind. But I'd add one other thing. It's a very, very delicate balance for a private sector enterprise to enter into public policy. And you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't.